they stopped, and he could see clearly it were two little beings, about 3.5 feet tall. In 2007, January the 8th of 2007, I had just come through a near-death experience early 2 years before, from 17 years of Crohn's disease, and a business that was a very large construction company. I mean, we did about $15 million or more a year in building. And so we were in the middle of wars, and we're here in Fort Bragg, and all the soldiers were gone, and there was no houses selling. And so stress and Crohn's don't go together very well. And what happened is I was losing everything I had. It was going down the tubes in interest, 60 and 80,000 a month in interest. And back then it was 8% on construction notes. Now it's a whole lot less, but it caused the Crohn's to get so far out that I ended up in the hospital having a near-death experience and unable to work for 2 years. I couldn't get out of bed. It was, if I tried to go to the office, I was right back at home. And so this was a very hard time. And all my children were small, and I'm worried to death about them and everything. And so I recovered from this near death, and we sold our home, moved next door to my father out where I was raised in the country. And so Dad kept encouraging me to try to work, to try to get out. I needed to. And so in late 2006, I took on a job on the coast building a beach house. I didn't do the work, but I was overseeing some guys, some subcontractors. Job went on for 4 months or more. Come New Year's, we were done, all but a punch list. And so I told the guys to come home when they're finished. I'd already packed up and moved back to Fayetteville. And so they come home on that day, the 7th, and the 8th, I'm sorry, of 2007. Elvis Presley's birthday, I'll never forget, because one of the people that saw this thing, one of the neighbors said maybe Elvis has returned, because she knew it was his birthday. It happened to be somebody I knew. So get back to my thoughts train where I was going. So long story short, on that day, they cashed their checks. They came back and they're like, let's celebrate. Let's go fishing. We didn't have a job lined up for no time soon. It was over and I was ready to get home. So I told them, yeah, my wife was gone for a couple of days with her mother, with all the kids except for Chris Jr. He was with me. He was 17 years old. They cashed their checks. They came, when they got home, they called me. I had the only four-wheel drive. I picked them up. They lived about 3 miles from me, and the river was about 3 miles in the opposite direction. So we drove down through this, across the field, turned off the paved road and crossed the middle of a field to the back side of the field where the forest is. And the road went down in a gully to the river. So we drove down in there and it muddy, and about 2:30 in the day, parked the car. They got out and sat on the bank fishing. I made sure they were happy, and Chris Jr. was happy. And so I told him I'm going to walk the forest and try to see some wildlife, not telling them, you know, I'm at the lowest point in my life. So I came back out about 4:00, 4:15. It's starting to get dark. In January, it gets dark about 5:30. It's pretty dark. So it was probably 4:45 or 4:30 maybe when I came back out, and I said, "You guys want to go fishing more? Or you want to go home?" They wanted to fish. So I encouraged them to help me get firewood and get a fire going, because I knew it was going to frost that night. It was calling for lower than 32. So I would say it was 10 after 5 when I had a good fire and a big bunch of spare wood to the side, and they were sitting on the bank. And I said, I'm gonna walk back up to the field that we drove in on and sit till the sun sets to see if any wildlife comes out. And still thinking, I'm crying out the whole time. I'm talking to whoever's up there to hear me, because I'm suffering from depression, sickness. I'm still sick, going to the bathroom 15, 20 times a day. It was that bad. And just not having to work. My doctor made me get rid of my cell phone, everything that could cause stress. So I'm all alone and talking to the universe, walking away from them at the fire. It's a 1/4 mile to the top of the field where the field starts. You got to go uphill a good 100 feet to a 1/4 mile. So as I'm walking along that trail, it's about 15 after 5, 10 after 5, and the sun was pretty low. And the road made one turn. It goes down, parallels the river, flat, 1/8 of a mile. Make a left toward the west. It goes uphill 1/8 of a mile. So as I'm walking this first part, flat part, I keep hearing something in the woods rattling in the woods, walking. I thought, sounds like a deer maybe. I'd stop to listen more, and it stopped. And I did that twice. I stopped. And when it stopped, it started freaking me out. And I'm in the Boone and Crockett record book for a 160-pound black bear, 660-pound black bear. I've hunted all my life, and this stuff never bothered me. What I'm hearing now has got me nervous. So I actually get down on my hands and knees twice, 3 times, trying to see what's trailing me. I thought deer. I thought what sounds like 2 feet, maybe it's a turkey. And about the 3rd time that I stood up and walked, I made to the turn. And when I got to that turn, the sun's coming down from the west down that lane, so it's not as dark. And I felt this relief. And I thought, I'm gonna hurry on up to the top of that hill. It's getting dark. And I'm trying to get this out of my thoughts. So I get about 2/3 of the way to the top of the hill. And I'm watching the ground because it's muddy and thick grass, and the bushes are close on either side. The truck mirrors would drag the bushes on each side. So I'm watching my step, and I get within 20 feet of the top of that hill. I'm looking up, right? So you can't see the trees on the far side. So as I get far enough up the hill where the tops of the trees begin to show up, just before the tops, I see what I thought the first time I looked up was the sun. Same size, glowing orange, but it looked different. And I looked down to take a step. When I looked back up, I stopped a second, said, that don't look right. And I'm a commercial pilot. I'm trained. I know what is and what isn't an aircraft or anything. So it didn't take me long to recognize something that wasn't right. So I took about 3 more steps, and I look and I start to see a second one sitting right beside it. So what I'm seeing now is the sun has set behind the trees, and there are 2 balls of fire that looks like the sun, both of them sitting on top of the trees on the other side of the field, 200 yards away. And I'm just mesmerized, looking at it, and then fear sets in. I'm like, oh my God. So I squatted down using the hill to hide myself from these 2 balls of fire. And I'm thinking, what am I doing? I'm going through every thought I need. And I'm crying out to something from heaven, and I didn't realize that's what's come. So I'm scared to death. I'm looking at these two balls of fire, and I turn and I look down the hill and I raise up and they're still there, and I'm making my way out. I'm fishing to run back down that hill, and I'm thinking how hard it's going to be to run through this mud and these thick bushes and the ruts, liable to fall. I'm not too stable. I've been sick and frail and everything else. And I had made my mind up to run. I don't know how long I sat there, but it seemed like a minute, maybe two, looking at these two things. And so when I decided I'm gonna run, I turned my whole body and I looked back and raised up to see if they were still there before I dashed. And the minute I did that, a third one up above me appeared out of thin air. Ploop, it just came on, this big orange ball of fire, and it went straight down within a second and was sitting beside the other two. And this chill factor came over me. My hair became electrified, and I knew it saw me. I knew they knew I was standing there, and I knew, I just knew I was done for. And at that moment, then I didn't realize what happened. Next thing I remember, I'm running up to the fire, and a lot of people want to know what it was like to be taken, what happened at that moment. But to continue the story, I didn't find that out till later. But to continue the story, I run back down in I don't even remember the last 30 yards. I run like in a little jog the last 30 yards, and I see the fire. And there's 2-3 guys standing at the fire, and they're not fishing, and they're looking down at the fire, and it's real small. And they see me trotting up, and I'm excited to say, man, you won't believe what I just saw at the top of the hill. And they're like, where in the world have you been? And that ain't the words they use. I mean, it was like, we've been looking you all night. I'm still coming to them, right? And I don't even recognize, I didn't even notice the truck was moved from where I parked it. So they had been out looking for me. And Chris Jr. wasn't there. So I got freaked out, and I said, where's my son? I worry about him. He's not there. And he's always been the kind that was always nervous around me, always with me, and didn't want me out of his sight. And so what had happened, what I found out within a couple of minutes of me trotting up to the fire, I hadn't even stopped good till I took off looking for him. They said, well, we've been looking for you for a long time, over 2 hours or more. And Chris Jr., he's been gone for 2 hours or more. He went back into the cul-de-sac. So we drove to a dead end. He went to the dead end and went on in the forest. That's where I'd gone earlier that day. So he went that way on foot. One guy stayed at the fire, and 2 went looking for me. This was 2 hours after I'd been gone. So 4 hours I'd been missing. And so I left them in a trot, heading to the back of the cul-de-sac. So grassy, about 3/4 acre grassy circle, or sort of pear shape. So I run on back, and I'm shouting for him. I don't have a flashlight. It's dark, stars shining, and he wouldn't say a word. And I ran on up to the edge of the woods, and around here in North Carolina, it's thick around the edges. You can go in the forest, it'll open up. But right around the edges, it's thick. And what had happened was, James, where he was standing, he could look straight down the 1/8 of a mile road to where it made the turn left, where I felt safe. Long story short, he was back there looking for me while 2 drove out in the car. 1 stayed at the fire. He saw, before they left, he saw 2 red balls of fire come out of the left side of the forest, cross that road to the right. Freaked him out. He ran over to the fire. So he'd gone back there earlier. And he said, I'm telling you, I saw it. And they thought he was, just a young boy. I saw this ball of fire go in the woods. And they're like, don't be messing with us, Junior. One guy was telling him that. So long story short, it was like they didn't want to believe him. He goes back to where he was standing, and he's looking for his dad. And he's very upset by now. And He looks back down the road. These two red orbs come back out of the woods on the riverside. And when they get to the road, they start towards him. He watches these two little balls of red orbs, red glowing balls, come all the way. And when it got within 20 feet of him, he'd already backed up under these bushes, got down on his stomach trying to hide because he got nervous. And when they got within 15, 20 feet, they stopped, and he could see clearly it were two little beings, about 3.5 feet tall. They had these like goggles. They glow red, and but they're just these round, glowing, look like goggles, and these little translucent glowing beings. But he couldn't scream, he couldn't move. When there was one always looking at him, and when it would look at him, he couldn't shout. He felt paralyzed, and he told that many times. So when the truck drove out, when Junior disappeared, they couldn't find him. They were calling for him. He wouldn't answer because he couldn't. So they got in the truck and drove out, and one guy stayed the fire. And when the truck came back in, the light coming down the path shined on them, and Christopher said they jumped down in this stump hole where the hurricane had blown over a big oak tree, and the root ball was sticking up, and they just went down ground level to hide, but they were still there at him. And they never left, because when I ran back to the back to get Junior, and I finally found him, he'd come up out of those bushes as I'm going in the forest trying to keep from putting my eyes out with a twig. And I'm panicked by now, worried about him, but all what's happening and how these guys were acting. And I hear him crying, and he comes up and he's, "Daddy, where you been? Where you been, Daddy? These creatures." And I'm like, "What?" And so I got freaked out about that time. And so I grab him and we walk back to the fire, and he's wailing, he's not happy. And these guys are freaked out bad by this time, hearing what he's saying and what I'm saying. And their eyes are like that. And one of them had seen this red ball of fire, light, little orb, saw a glance of it. So he knew. And about that time, I hadn't had him back to the fire. And where I found him from where the fire is probably 75 yards at the most. When I got him back to the fire, maybe 2 minutes into trying to sort this out, he's like, "I want to go home. I want to go home." That's all I could say. One of the guys shouted, "Look," and we all look up, and it looked like stars, like Venus. These balls of fire you see moving around up there, where there was 8 or 9 of them, and they went out and they came back together, and it did this maneuver in the sky, and 3 of them came down and landed on the ground on the other side of the river. Less than 100 yards from where we were standing are 3 45 or 50-foot balls. They look like eggs. If you see them in a distance, they're round. When they get up close, they're kind of globular. It's almost, sometimes they look like a raindrop, but they landed on the river and they're pulsating this bright light. So one can imagine a 4 grown man and a child is freaked out, never touched the fire, never got our poles, never a cooler, nothing. We ran to the truck, jumped in it, and all I could hear was beating on my seat, screaming to get us out of there. And when I think about it, I wasn't afraid more. I was, something happened to me and I didn't realize it at that time, because the whole drive home was harrowing. We took off from the fire, started up this path, this first 1/8 of a mile, and they're saying, "Run, go faster." They're screaming, "Go faster." And I'm like, I can't go any faster. My mirrors are dragging those bushes on either side, and the truck's wallowing in the mud. And one of the guys in the truck said that this red orb come out of the forest back where I found Chris Jr. and was coming up behind the truck.